The Second World War affected millions of people. During the conflict, the balance of power was held by the leaders of three nations: the United Kingdom, the United States, and the USSR. March the 31st, 1945. A British Royal Air Force plane lands in Crimea with a very important passenger, the British Prime Minister's wife, Clementine Churchill.
Это был подарок, который ей был преподнесен Черчиллем в связи с ее юбилеем, поскольку на следующий день ей исполнялось 60 лет.
Oleg Chlobostov, Secret Service's historian, explains why that unusual visit took place.
Это была очень энергичная женщина, имевшая очень активную гражданскую позицию. После нападения на Советский Союз Германии она создала фонд помощи Советскому Союзу. Советские люди действительно испытывали благодарность этой женщине.
Clementine Churchill became the first financial donor. The fund eventually raised a total of more than £9 million sterling.
Это сумма абсолютно баснословная по тем временам. И надо сказать, что эти субсидии поступали не от каких-то там банкиров, топ-менеджеров, предпринимателей, а от простых трудяг, рабочих, которые понимали объективно, что Советский Союз защищает Великобританию от возможности порабощения войсками вермахта.
Clementine Churchill undertook a 42-day tour of Russian cities. She brought medical equipment for Red Army soldiers. She met chocolate factory workers and brought gifts to schools and children's homes. And in this unique footage, she meets pioneers at the famous Artek children's camp.
7 мая, в канун Победы, она была принята Сталином, который тоже поблагодарил за всю ту помощь, которую была оказана Советскому Союзу.
The Soviet government awarded Clementine Churchill the Order of the Red Banner of Labour and the Gold Badge for Excellence in Sanitary Defence. May the 9th, 1945, the British Prime Minister's wife celebrated Victory Day in Moscow.
9 мая – это выступление Клементины Черчилль по радио, где она обращается с приветствием советскому народу о том, что мы победили. И вот этот момент она вот была с советским народом.
Meanwhile, her husband, Winston Churchill, was planning a new war, Operation Unthinkable. Britain and the United States allegedly planned to use 12 remaining German divisions to attack the USSR on July the 1st, 1945.
Наверное, нормальному человеческому рассудку не понять вот такие вот сложные кульбиты, когда, с одной стороны, любимую жену направляет в Советский Союз и тут же отдает команду готовить план войны против этой страны.
Winston Churchill, British Prime Minister, Army Reservist, journalist, writer, artist, and Nobel laureate in literature. Churchill's father was a descendant of the Duke of Marlborough. His mother was the daughter of a prominent American financier. Churchill graduated from the Royal Military College, but never received a higher education.
He was a bit of a troublemaker. He did not go to university, he did not want to, I think. He caused some trouble at school, but it was a very good school, Harrow.
A former British diplomat, author William Mallinson, is well acquainted with Winston Churchill's biography. the greatest Briton ever, according to a BBC poll.
He started military career actually in Cuba. He was actually fighting for Spain against the rebels in Cuba. And then he was in India. He then went to Sudan, was even at the Battle of Omdurman, and he saw serious military action. He was in the Boer War fighting, and he was actually imprisoned and escaped. More than that, he also enlisted during the Great War, what we call the First World War.
Churchill was also a romantic figure. He wanted to be a great war leader like his famous forebear, the Duke of Marlborough.
Paul Craig Roberts is a former Assistant Treasury Secretary for Economic Policy. In his writing, he analyzes the factors that led to World War II.
Churchill had gone into the war seeking power. It was his avenue to the prime ministership.
Josef Vissarionovich Stalin, original name Djugashvili, the son of a shoemaker and a peasant woman. He had ruled the country since 1922.
If you look objectively at the achievements of the Soviet Union during Stalin's period, you would have to say that they were tremendous. Social welfare benefits were provided to the Soviet population, medical care, education, living standards.
Professor Grover Furr, PhD, at Montclair State University in New Jersey, is well known for his work on Soviet history and politics.
He was the major political figure, certainly one of the most prominent political leaders of the 20th century.
But at first, the Allies treat Uncle Joe, as Stalin is referred to in the West, with arrogance. The Soviet leader was from a low social background and had been through prisons and exile.
So Stalin rose from the lowest of the ranks. He in fact named himself Stalin, which means man of steel.
Scott Bennett, a counter-terrorism specialist and former U.S. Army analyst, is well versed in the complex history of U.S.-Soviet cooperation.
In the Second World War years, you have Stalin rise up and quite an effective leadership role under World War II and counteracting the German advances.
Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the 32nd U.S. president, led the country from 1933 to 1945.
Franklin Roosevelt came from an extraordinarily wealthy family, a very high elite socialite family dating back to the 1600s. The Roosevelt family, the Delano family were old money that had built their fortunes in merchant, shipbuilding, other trades.
Roosevelt was a pragmatist, and when it suited American interests, was prepared to cooperate with the Soviet Union. It was under his rule that U.S.-Soviet diplomatic relations were established in 1933.
Franklin Delano Roosevelt is recognized by many in the American historical and academic and political ranks as one of the greatest four-term presidents in history, the only president to ever serve 4 terms, in fact, for his work in resuscitating the United States after an economic depression that occurred after the fall of the stock market in the 1920s.
The Big Three is how the Allied Second World War leaders were known. They had different personalities, were from very different backgrounds, and had opposing views. Each defended their own people's and ruling classes' interests.
Der bis dahin in der Geschichte der Menschheit größte Krieg gab es noch nicht.
In his books, Anton Lazzo, who has a PhD in history, thoroughly analyzes the events of World War II.
Es war auch erstmalig in der Geschichte der Menschheit, dass ein solches Bündnis im Krieg gegen Deutschland zwischen Staaten entstanden war, in denen verschiedene gesellschaftliche und politische Ordnungen herrschten. Erstmalig eigentlich. Also es waren neue Situationen. Es gab keine Rezepte.
Officially, World War II began when German troops attacked Poland. On September the 1st, 1939. But reshaping the world had started long before that. 1938. Austrian Anschluss. The invasion of Czechoslovakia and its partition by Germany, Poland and Hungary. Czechoslovakia's allies, Great Britain and France, are accused of betraying it for the sake of peace with Nazi Germany. Poland and Hungary took part in the partition of Czechoslovakia. Some in Europe felt that Poland had enthusiastically taken part in the robbery and destruction of the Czechoslovak state. US President Roosevelt had no objection to either the Austrian Anschluss or the partition of Czechoslovakia. The United States had no desire to interfere in Europe's conflict. The world was sliding into a major war, but Churchill and Stalin were the only European politicians who seemed to know it.
Советский Союз призывал гарантировать безопасность Чехословакии, в том числе путем посылки советских войск в Чехословакию, но Польша отказалась пропустить войска через свою территорию. И тем самым, в общем-то, предав своего геополитического союзника, а в дальнейшем уже сама поучаствовала в разделу, когда была отторгнута от Чехословакии Тешинская область.
The Soviet offer was in effect ignored. Events took their course as if Soviet Russia didn't exist. For that, a heavy price would soon be paid. In Munich, Britain and Germany signed a mutual non-aggression pact. That was the culmination of the policy to appease Hitler. "I have brought you peace," Prime Minister Chamberlain proudly told the British people on his return from Munich. Churchill's reply: "We have sustained a total and unmitigated defeat. Those are the features which marked an improvident stewardship for which Great Britain and France have dearly to pay."
Churchill realized, and he wasn't alone in the British leadership, that this policy of what's called appeasement, encouraging Hitler, had been a big mistake.
It was clear to Churchill that a redrawing of European borders had begun. War was inevitable. But as he wasn't a cabinet minister, he couldn't change anything. Much later, Churchill will write, "Those were the years of my desolate solitude." The situation in Munich was also noticed in the United States. Some often said that Hitler must have forced Chamberlain at gunpoint. France and England have concluded a shameful peace. March 1939, the Soviet Union had a proposal for the Western countries to form an anti-fascist bloc to counter Hitler's intentions.
The Soviets have been trying to rally the West, make a stand with them against fascism. They opposed Munich. They opposed allowing Hitler into Czechoslovakia, but nobody would do that. So it wasn't just in 1939 when the Soviets proposed an alliance with Britain and France against Hitler. It had been actually throughout the last half of the 1930s.
Peter Kuznick, writer and professor of history at the American University in Washington, D.C., analyzes the balance of power that developed in pre-war Europe.
We could have stopped Hitler. We could have prevented World War II because Hitler was weak and knew he was weak, and he was bluffing and assuming that the West was not going to stand up to him, that the West was hoping, and many elements in the West were hoping, that he was just going to go east. So in the 30s, the Soviets are the ones who are most strongly opposed to the Nazis.
Negotiations between the USSR, Britain, and France to establish an anti-fascist bloc reached an impasse because secret British-German negotiations were taking place at the same time. In return for guaranteeing the integrity of the British Empire, Britain offered Hitler freedom of action in the East. For Britain to survive, Russia had to be sacrificed. Churchill objects. If, for instance, Mr. Chamberlain on receipt of the Russian offer had replied, "Yes, let us three band together and break Hitler's neck," history might have gone a different way. It was clear to Stalin that the Western powers were ignoring his proposals and could no longer be relied upon, and by 1939, almost all of Europe had already signed agreements with Hitler. 1933, Germany, France, Britain, and Italy conclude the Four-Power Pact. 1934, the Pilsudski-Hitler Pact between Poland and Germany is signed. 1935, the naval agreement between Britain and Germany is concluded. 1938, Britain, France, and Italy agree to divide Czechoslovakia between Germany, Poland, and Hungary. 1939, non-aggression treaties are signed between Germany, Latvia, and Estonia. August the 22nd, 1939, Moscow. The Soviet Commissar for Foreign Affairs, Molotov, and German Foreign Minister Ribbentrop sign a non-aggression pact. The pact made it impossible for Nazi Germany to form alliances with other states.
Für die Sowjetunion ist, zu verhindern, dass Chamberlain und Daladier zu diesen faschistischen Mächten sozusagen hinüberwechseln, England und Frankreich. Dass kein Bündnis entsteht zwischen England, Frankreich und Deutschland, zum Beispiel, oder Italien auch noch mit.
The United States continued its policy of appeasing Imperial Japan. The Americans held on to the hope that Japan would refocus its attention on the USSR.
The Soviet Union did not want to be caught fighting a two-front war, a war with Japan in the east and also a war with Germany in the west. And they knew that the Germans were going to attack sooner or later. Also, when the British and French refused to form an alliance against Germany with the Soviet Union, the Polish government also refused.
On January the 26th, 1934, Poland became the first European country to conclude a non-aggression treaty with Germany. The Pilsudski-Hitler Pact. Along with Germany, Poland planned to attack the USSR. Poland must not remain idle at this historic moment. The main goal is to weaken and crush Russia. But on September the 1st, 1939, Poland was attacked by Germany.
Будущее мира Польша, как и многие другие государства, как Литва, Латвия, Эстония, они просто-напросто не вписывались. И поэтому она была абсолютно списана со счетов истории. Ну, было какое-то государство, и не будет его, это будут исконно германские территории.
As the crushed Polish government flees to England, Poland ceases to exist as a state. In German-occupied Poland, the most hideous form of terrorism prevails. More than 15,000 intellectual leaders are shot. 300 in one place. At another, a group of drunken German officers are said to have shot 70 hostages. 136 12 or 13-year-old boys are butchered. And just 3 weeks later, Stalin sends his army into Poland, which has lost sovereignty. England and France sympathized with the introduction of Soviet troops. It was vital for the Soviet Union to push the German army as far west as possible. to buy time and gather forces from all corners of its colossal empire.
The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact ended up being a crucial factor in a Soviet and ultimately an Allied victory. If they hadn't had that extra 200 or 300 kilometers to travel, they might rather well have occupied Moscow. Likewise, it's quite possible that it saved Leningrad, because the German armies were very close to Leningrad as well. Hitler had already declared that he was going to kill all the inhabitants of Leningrad and destroy the city and give it to Finland. The Finnish leader, Marshal Mannerheim, was 100% in favor of that.
Meanwhile, honoring his promise to the American people not to get involved in the war, Roosevelt passes the Neutrality Act. During this period, the US clearly shows hostility towards the Soviet Union. By the spring of 1940, all relations between the two countries are frozen.
The Americans remained neutral, which Roosevelt later regretted because he understood this was the time to stop the Nazis and the fascist forces.
May the 10th, 1940. German troops invade France, and in just a month, Hitler enters Paris. Most of the country is occupied, and the French army is no more.
Для Советского Союза падение Франции было холодным душем. Капитуляция Франции означала принципиально иную геополитическую обстановку.
In his work, Doctor of Historical Sciences Alexei Isaev assesses the events of World War II.
И для Советского Союза это было стимулом для немедленных шагов по повышению боеспособности Красной Армии. Советский Союз, конечно, еще с 1939 года понимал, что, возможно, придется сражаться в одиночку, и все для этого делалось.
With his appeasement policy in tatters, Prime Minister Chamberlain is forced to tender his resignation. On May the 10th, 1940, the day Germany invades France, Winston Churchill becomes the new British Prime Minister. I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat.
He replaced Chamberlain because, as is well known, Chamberlain did not want a war with Germany. Churchill, it appears, had a very different view. He never wavered from wanting and insisting on war, pursuing the war with Germany. He didn't trust the Germans, he didn't trust Hitler, he didn't like Hitler.
August the 13th, 1940. The Third Reich launches massive aerial attacks on British cities. The next night, 80 British aircraft attack Berlin. In return, the Luftwaffe bombs London. Operation Blitz lasts almost 8 months. Many British cities suffer catastrophic destruction. Churchill appears everywhere, atop piles of rubble left by airstrikes, in factories and hospitals. He gives speeches, works on military plans. But for his age, Churchill is 66, he himself would have rushed into the battle. But England cannot withstand Germany alone. Churchill asked Roosevelt for help.
Roosevelt had no affection for Churchill. He had no trust of the British. He, in fact, saw the British as penetrating much of the United States State Department, intelligence agencies, academic institutions, all to more or less influence the United States and government and academia to being much more in line with the British Atlanticist agenda.
The United States thinks war is war, but business is business. In return for help, and in exchange for old World War I destroyers, the US demands the right to use 8 British military bases in the Atlantic. We didn't receive anything from the US that we didn't pay for. In 1940 alone, Britain pays the United States $4.5 billion in cash, a huge amount of money at the time. And when Roosevelt doubts the UK's ability to pay, he sends a cruiser to Cape Town where £50 million of British gold reserves are stored. In desperation, Churchill writes to Roosevelt, "In the midst of war, Great Britain is close to bankruptcy." Roosevelt sees no benefit in Britain's defeat, after which the US would run the risk of facing war too.
И тогда был придуман ленд-лиз, который предусматривал бесплатную передачу вооружений и военной техники. И на слушании в Конгрессе была проведена такая аналогия, что когда у соседа горит дом, вы ему бесплатно отдадите шланг, чтобы он потушил свой дом, не дожидаясь, пока пожар перекинется на ваш.
However, Lend-Lease supplies are immediately entangled in financial obligations.
То, что не было использовано, то, что не возвращается, требовалось оплатить, что легло большим грузом на Британию и привело к коллапсу ее колониальной системы.
Churchill's goal was to preserve the British Empire. The United States wanted an open world in which the American dollar could penetrate, which American trade would have access everywhere and to markets and to labor and to resources around the globe. So they had very different kinds of conflicting interests.
Churchill warned Stalin of an impending attack on the USSR. In the face of great danger, he seeks an alliance with Russia. Stalin doesn't reply. He doesn't trust Churchill.
At 4 o'clock this morning, Hitler attacked and invaded Russia. Suddenly, without declaration of war, without even an ultimatum, the German bombs rained down from the sky upon the Russian cities. The Russian danger is therefore our danger and the danger of the United States.
2 days later, US President Roosevelt also gives a speech supporting the USSR. But there are other political forces in the United States.
Harry Truman makes a speech in December of '41 in the Senate. He says, if the Russians are winning, we should support the Germans. And if the Germans are winning, we support the Russians. And that way, let them destroy each other. So there was that kind of sentiment in the West at this time. Dangerous, destructive.
Roosevelt warns Stalin of Japan's intention to attack the Soviet Union. But Soviet intelligence reports state that the attack is still in doubt. It's imperative that the US makes it clear to Japan that if they attack, the Soviet Union will have support. But the British and American authorities will not support the USSR. The US military assures Roosevelt that Germany will quickly conquer Russia all the way to the Urals. Churchill recalled that 4 out of 5 War Department experts had no doubt that Russia would be knocked out in a few days. Meanwhile, the Red Army is withstanding a serious blow. The Russians are the first serious adversary.
То, что Советский Союз был не готов к войне, это неправда. Советский Союз готовился к войне прежде всего и экономически, и с военной точки зрения. Другой вопрос, что летом 1941 года нас все же застали врасплох, но с точки зрения игры в долгую, мобилизация промышленности, которая началась на самом деле не в 1941 году, а гораздо раньше, и многие решения сработали и помогли не проиграть в 1941 году, как проиграла в 1940 году Франция.
The Allies realized that the Soviets will fight Hitler to the last, and only then, in October 1941, is Lend-Lease extended to the USSR. But the majority of supplies, about 80%, still go to Britain.
Все эти поставки осуществлялись на платной основе с отложенным платежом. В течение каких-то там лет была договоренность, что Советский Союз, значит, погашает вот стоимость всех полученных товаров. Что было осуществлено? Более того, было осуществлено дважды. То есть сумма первоначально говорена, она была намного превышена по инициативе американской стороны.
December the 7th, 1941, Japan's forces attack Pearl Harbor, the main US military base in the Pacific. America is forced to join the war.
Its vast industrial base, which had been used for the manufacturing civilian technology, was quickly reorchestrated to produce munitions and tanks and aircraft and naval vessels for funding of the war.
As early as summer 1941, Stalin raises the question of opening a second front line with Churchill, but the British Prime Minister declines, citing difficulties with troop deployment. Roosevelt promises that the US Army will land in France in 1942, but later asks Churchill to inform Stalin that the operation will not go ahead. Churchill flies to Moscow. The situation on the Soviet front line is dire. The Nazis are advancing to the Kuban and North Caucasus and are approaching Stalingrad. Stalin's son, Senior Lieutenant Yakov Djugashvili, is in captivity in a Nazi concentration camp.
Британский премьер приехал в Москву на очень тяжелом общем стратегическом фоне. И Сталин фактически общался с Черчиллем очень холодно и резко. Он напрямую обвинял англичан в трусости, в том, что если вы будете так же осторожничать, как вы осторожничали до этого, то у вас с войной ничего не получится.
Churchill wants to leave Moscow, but Stalin invites him to his Kremlin apartment. The banquet lasts more than 7 hours, and they begin to get along. If only I could dine with Stalin once a week, there would be no trouble at all. November 1943. Tehran, the Iranian capital. All three countries have embassies here. It's the first big meeting of the Big Three.
Сталин настаивал на том, чтобы конференция проводилась в той точке, которая имеет телеграфную связь с Москвой. Потому что в этот момент на Советско-Германском фронте разворачивалось колоссальное по своим масштабам сражение на правобережной Украине, потому что радиограммы могут быть перехвачены и расшифрованы.
The American embassy is on the outskirts of the city, and due to terrorist threats, Roosevelt accepts an invitation to settle in the Soviet embassy, where the meetings are also held. Churchill attends by walking along a covered corridor, connecting the Soviet and British embassies. Britain's Prime Minister doesn't approve of the Stalin-Roosevelt rapprochement.
It's further complicated by the fact that Churchill was not only a colonialist, but an outspoken racist, which deeply offended, especially the American leaders, Roosevelt and Henry Wallace, Vice President Wallace.
Of course he was a racist. He said he hated people with slit eyes and pigtails, which means that it's Chinese and Japanese. But we must remember that in those days, most people were racist.
His attitude towards Indians in general was extremely racist and derogatory. His colleague in the cabinet, Lord Emery, recorded him as saying, "Indians are beastly people with a beastly religion."
Ajay Goyal is an Indian journalist who knows exactly how the British Crown colonized his homeland. In 1943, at the time of the Tehran Conference, a great famine broke out in Bengal, in which more than 4 million people died.
It was not human error. It was a conscious decision by Winston Churchill to deprive Bengal of food, grains, and ship them to Europe because he wanted to build grain reserves in Europe in case a second front was opened in the war in Europe. When he was told people are dying in very large numbers, his response was to write on a file, if they are dying in so many numbers, how come Gandhi is still alive?
At Churchill's request, Roosevelt sends American ships loaded with grain to Bengal. But Churchill diverts them to Europe, and Roosevelt is well aware of it.
There was no doubt in anyone's mind that there was a great catastrophe unfolding in Bengal. But Churchill's decision was, so be it.
The first meeting radically changes Roosevelt's attitude to Stalin. It's a pleasure working with him. There's nothing devious. He outlines the subject he wants discussed, and he sticks to it.
Roosevelt warms up to Stalin, and he starts talking to Stalin and making fun of the British, making fun of Churchill. Says Winston got out of bed on the wrong side today, and by the end of that, he was calling him Uncle Joe. And in some ways, the U.S. and the Soviets were more on the same page in certain respects than the U.S. and the British were at the time.
During the same period, the Germans offered Stalin a trade for his son Yakov, who was being held in a concentration camp, in exchange for General Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, captured near Stalingrad. The Kremlin's master answered, "I don't trade soldiers for marshals." The Allies knew about it.
Roosevelt was notorious of being very complimentary towards Stalin and Russia in general and its people, and very cold and distant to Winston Churchill.
Stalin's standing in Tehran was very strong. The Germans had surrendered near Stalingrad. The great tank battle of the Kursk Bulge had been won. The Red Army was advancing. But Great Britain was losing its influence. It was obvious for everyone, including Churchill. Later he said, "Caught between the great Russian bear on one side and the American buffalo on the other, there was I, a poor little English donkey." The key issue of the Tehran Conference, the opening of a second front, froze again. "We have too many things to do at home to waste our time here," said Stalin. He was going to leave the conference. After that, the Allies promised to open the second front no later than in May 1944. A constructive dialogue began. Iran's future and Europe's post-war architecture were discussed. Roosevelt proposed to divide Germany into 5 small states. Churchill agreed. But Stalin insisted on preserving Germany's unity.
Тегеран – это был пик хороших взаимоотношений Востока и Запада. Большая тройка никогда не была настолько дружной и конструктивной, как она была в Тегеране.
June the 6th, 1944, Normandy. The Allies opened the Second Front 11 months before victory.
After the German war machine had been broken down, that was when the British and the Americans really focused more power into assaulting Germany. But they did it at a tremendous cost to the Russian people and the Russian soldiers, who suffered more casualties than any other people in any other nation of the war.
Operation Bagration was an even greater disaster for Hitler than the Battle of Stalingrad. It took the Red Army 5 weeks to advance 720 kilometers to Warsaw. Nearly 20 German divisions were destroyed completely. Another 50 suffered great losses.
Throughout most of the war, the Americans and the British were confronting 10 German divisions between us, while the Soviets were confronting more than 200 German divisions by themselves.
Crimea, Yalta, February 1945. The last meeting of the Big Three. At first, the Allies suggested meeting in Scotland, but Stalin laughed it off, saying he disliked men in skirts and dampness. In fact, the Soviet leader wanted the Allies to see the devastated territories of the USSR with their own eyes. Sympathizing with Roosevelt, Stalin put the grandest Livadia imperial palace at his disposal. Roosevelt had trouble getting about, so the main sessions were held there. The Soviet delegation was housed in the Yusupov Palace, the British in the Vorontsov Palace. The palaces had miraculously survived and had been fixed up for the Allies' meeting.
В Ялте встреча началась с рассказа об успехах Красной Армии на Советско-Германском фронте. Это произвело колоссальное впечатление на союзников. Союзники тем же самым похвастаться не могли. То есть по состоянию на февраль 1945 года дела у них шли еще ни шатка, ни валка. Красная Армия 4 февраля 1945 года стояла в 70 километрах от Берлина на плацдармах на Одере. Это был колоссальный успех огромных масштабов. В Ялте были открытые заседания, которые освещались прессой, были закрыты. Вот на закрытых заседаниях была достигнута договоренность о том, что через 2-3 месяца после окончания войны в Европе Советский Союз вступает в войну с Японией.
Roosevelt had a strong interest in the USSR moving against Japan, and Stalin needed to secure the USSR's eastern borders, get back South Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands, the territories lost during the Russo-Japanese War. Poland's fate was also being decided. Churchill wanted the exiled in London pro-Western government to return to Warsaw. Stalin needed friendly Poland, and he insisted on a free election. Roosevelt backed Stalin, and Churchill had to concede.
Предполагалось, что Польше отойдут обширные территории Германии, причем развитый в промышленном отношении. То есть это был, прямо скажем, царский подарок для будущей послевоенной Польши. И вот Польша, она создала тот самый холодок, с которого начиналась холодная война.
Roosevelt proposed a new international coalition, the United Nations Organization. The victorious countries were given the right to veto the UN's key decisions.
Пребывание в Крыму премьер-министр Великобритании Черчилль использовал и для определенных таких личных дел. Он обратился с просьбой, значит, посетить место захоронения его предка Мальборо, который погиб под Севастополем во время Крымской войны. Сталин вместе с Черчиллем туда подъехали, возложили цветы, исполнили вот такую вот давнюю мечту.
Already in Yalta, there were divisions among the Allies.
Sie saßen sich gegenüber in der Suche nach einer Lösung und praktizierten, Churchill vor allem, zugleich Antikommunismus und Antisowjetismus. Die Engländer, die Amerikaner wollten der Sowjetunion so viel Schaden zufügen, sie so schwächen, dass sie nach dem Krieg ein leichteres Spiel mit der Sowjetunion haben.
And a month later, in March 1945, the Allies entered secret negotiations with Germany for the surrender of the German troops in northern Italy.
Die Sowjetunion hat das mitbekommen, natürlich, Antrag gestellt, teilzunehmen. Es wurde aber abgelehnt. Die Westmächte verletzten damit noch vor Ende des Krieges ihre Verpflichtungen gegenüber der Sowjetunion als Alliierte. Ich bin mit der Sowjetunion sozusagen alliiert und verhandle gleichzeitig mit dem Feind. Aber auch vom politischen Gesichtspunkt ist es ein Verrat. Vom moralischen Gesichtspunkt gar nicht zu sprechen.
In a letter to President Roosevelt, Stalin directly accused the Allies of making a separate deal with Germany. Already terminally ill, Roosevelt wrote, "You've been misinformed." Stalin replied, "Our informants are modest and honest people."
Я не могу полностью исключить момент, что своими подчиненными Рузвельт был введен в заблуждение.
On April the 12th, 1945, Roosevelt died. And Harry Truman became the new US president.
We've got this little man without vision is now going to make the crucial decision at the most monumental turning point in history.
On April the 30th, 1945, a red flag was hoisted over the Reichstag. By this time, Hitler was dead, and his successor, Admiral Dönitz, negotiated a unilateral surrender in the West with the Allies and withdrew his divisions.
В это же время, в начале апреля 1945 года, Черчилль отдает приказ Генеральному штабу разработать план возможной войны против Советского Союза. Британские военные были настолько ошарашены этим указанием, что они назвали свою операцию немыслимой. То есть они считают это абсолютным безумием, невозможным и, тем не менее, выполняют.
Having received the information, Stalin ordered Marshal Zhukov to turn the army westwards. The Allies understood a surprise attack wouldn't work out.
Wenn Churchill bekanntlich die deutschen Kriegsgefangenen sozusagen mobilisiert hat gegen Deutschland erneut die Waffen sozusagen gegen Sowjetunion damals zu richten in Norddeutschland und er zur Potsdamer Konferenz kommt, Stalin ihn fragt, ja, was ist denn das? Ist da was da? Was macht ihr da? Und Churchill sagt, ja, da bin ich nicht informiert, da muss ich mich informieren. Dieses Doppelspiel eigentlich der Westmächte.
The double play continued. Germany signed the surrender on May the 7th at the American command headquarters in the French city of Reims. Stalin was furious. The Soviet people had borne the main brunt of the war, but the surrender had been signed on French territory, with the Anglo-Americans playing the leading roles. The act of surrender should be carried out as an important historic event and accepted in the place where the fascist aggression came from, in Berlin, and not unilaterally, but by the high command of all the anti-Hitler coalition countries. The Allies had to consent. They agreed to consider the document signed in France as a preliminary one. The second unconditional surrender was signed in the Berlin suburb of Karlshorst. The German signatories were senior military officials, headed by the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, General Field Marshal Keitel. The Soviet Union was represented by Marshal of the Soviet Union Zhukov, the Allies by British Air Chief Marshal Tedder. It happened on May the 8th at 22:43 European time. In Moscow, it was 12:43 a.m. on May the 9th. July the 17th, 1945. The Potsdam Conference.
В Потсдаме встречались уже не те лидеры Большой Тройки, которые вели Вторую мировую войну. То есть Большая Тройка претерпела изменения, причем она претерпела изменения прямо в процессе тех переговоров, которые шли в Потсдаме.
Churchill lost the general election in Great Britain.
During the Potsdam Conference in July, Churchill is voted out of office by the British people. They'd had enough of Churchill. And so even though now he's revered as this great war leader, at the time the British people were not quite as enthusiastic about his leadership.
Churchill negotiated in Potsdam for 9 days. The conference was concluded by new British Prime Minister Clement Attlee.
На должность президента Соединенных Штатов вступил Гарри Труман, человек, который был настроен к Советскому Союзу куда более враждебно, чем Рузвельт.
Roosevelt was convinced that a lasting peace was impossible without the Soviet Union. Roosevelt was the last US leader who pursued peace, not war.
The last cable that Roosevelt wrote to Churchill right before he died, he said these issues between us and the Soviets come up every day and they all work out and they get resolved. We should continue to work together. Roosevelt was convinced that the Americans and the Soviets would remain friends and allies in the post-war period.
In Potsdam, Truman got a message. It's a little boy about the atomic bomb. When he told Stalin about it, the Soviet leader showed little interest. Uncle Joe didn't understand, Truman thought, but Stalin already knew everything. The issues raised in Yalta are laid down in Potsdam, and above all, Europe's post-war architecture. Germany was to pay reparations and be deprived of part of its territories. Königsberg and its surrounding areas were to be ceded to the USSR.
Союзники в тот момент еще серьезно зависели от Советского Союза в плане помощи в войне на Дальнем Востоке. Война на Дальнем Востоке была мощнейшим рычагом давления, которым скрадывались все те противоречия, которые стали себя проявлять после войны особенно остро.
What the Japanese dreaded the most was the idea that the Soviets might come into the Pacific War. Truman understood this. Stalin assures him that the Russians are coming in on schedule. Truman writes in his diary that Stalin will be in the Jap war by August 15th. Finny Japs when that occurs.
Fulfilling its obligations to the Allies, in August 1945, the Red Army conducts a lightning-fast 20-day operation against the 1.5 million strong Kwantung Army. With no military necessity, America dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That's enough. We are not interested in an alliance with Russia any longer. and we can stop carrying out our agreements with it. We should act as if there is no Yalta Agreement. Just a year later, on March the 5th, 1946, Churchill made his famous Fulton speech. The Cold War had begun.